The air hung thick over Rosewood Plantation that August morning in 1850, heavy with the scent of tobacco and something darker, something the white men couldn't name but felt in their bones, when Celeste walked past. She moved through the main house like a shadow given form, her steps soundless on the polished wood floors that other slaves had scrubbed until their hands bled. Thomas Whitmore stood at his study window, whiskey glass trembling in his hand, though it was barely past breakfast. He watched her cross the yard below, a basket of linens balanced on her hip, her face serene as a Madonna in the church paintings his wife collected. But Thomas knew better. He'd known better for 3 months now, ever since he'd found her in his study that night, sitting at his desk with his private ledgers spread before her like a feast. She hadn't run, hadn't apologized. She'd simply looked up at him with those dark, bottomless eyes and said in a voice smooth as silk over steel, "Your accounts don't match, Master Whitmore. A man could hang for such creative mathematics. He should have whipped her, should have sold her downriver to the sugar plantations where pretty faces rotted under the Louisiana sun. Instead, he'd stood frozen while she carefully closed each ledger, returned them to their exact positions, and walked past him so close her sleeve brushed his arm. The touch had burned like a brand. That was when the nightmares started. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Now, watching her disappear into the slave quarters, Thomas drained his glass and poured another. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. In his coat pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had nearly torn through, was a letter. Not from her, she'd never been so obvious, but about her, from Jacob Morrison, his fellow plantation owner 30 miles east. "She will destroy you," Morrison had written in handwriting that looked like it had been scratched by a dying man. "Not with violence, not with rebellion, with truth. Get rid of her, Thomas, before she finds yours." The letter had arrived 2 weeks ago. Yesterday, they'd found Morrison hanging from a beam in his tobacco barn, a neat pile of documents beneath his swinging feet, receipts for slaves sold twice, for cotton yields reported 3 times their actual weight, for debts that would ruin his family for generations, and on top of the pile, a single pressed flower, jasmine, the kind that grew wild near the slave quarters at Rosewood. Thomas's wife Margaret appeared in the study doorway, her face pinched with the particular displeasure she reserved for anything that disrupted her carefully maintained world. "You're drinking again." "It's hot." "It's always hot." She swept into the room, her hoop skirt clearing papers from the side table. "The Reverend is coming for dinner tomorrow. I need 3 girls from the quarters to help cook. I was thinking that Celeste—" "No." The word came out harder than Thomas intended. Margaret's eyebrow arched. "No? Use the others. Sarah, Mary, whoever. Not her. Why ever not? She's the most presentable one we have. Clean, quiet, knows how to serve properly." "Because I said so, Margaret." Thomas turned back to the window, unable to meet his wife's eyes. "Because the last time Celeste had served at one of Margaret's dinner parties, she'd stood behind the guests with perfect posture and a face like carved wood. And Thomas had watched 3 of his most powerful friends grow increasingly nervous as the evening progressed. By the end of the night, Judge Bartholomew had excused himself early, looking grey as ash. 2 days later, his youngest daughter had suddenly been sent to live with relatives in Charleston, and no one spoke of why. Celeste hadn't said a word. She'd simply refilled wine glasses and cleared plates with the same serene efficiency she brought to everything. But somehow, each man at that table had left looking like he'd seen a ghost, or worse, like he'd seen himself reflected in her knowing eyes and found the image unbearable. Margaret sighed with theatrical exasperation. "You've been impossible lately. Fine, I'll use the others." She paused at the door. Though I don't know why you're so particular about one slave girl. She's nothing special. But that was where Margaret was wrong, so terribly, dangerously wrong. In the slave quarters, Celeste sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she mended a tear in one of the overseer's shirts. Around her, the other women prepared the evening meal, their voices a low murmur of gossip and complaint. They rarely spoke to Celeste directly anymore, some from fear, some from jealousy, most from an instinct they couldn't name, the same instinct that kept prey animals from approaching a sleeping predator. "You hear about Master Morrison?" Sarah whispered from the corner where she was peeling potatoes. "They saying he done killed himself." "Lord have mercy," another voice responded. "That's the third one this year." "Ain't no mercy in it," old Ruth muttered from her seat near the fire. She was the eldest among them, her face a map of suffering etched deep into weathered skin. Her eyes found Celeste across the room. Just justice coming due. The younger women fell silent, uncomfortable. They all knew the stories, though no one dared speak them aloud. About the masters who'd touched Celeste when she first arrived at 15, beautiful and terrified. About the overseer who'd tried to force himself on her in the tobacco barn and was found the next morning transferred to a plantation in Mississippi, his reputation destroyed by rumors no one could trace. About the documents that seemed to appear and disappear, the letters that arrived at crucial moments, the whispered conversations that Celeste couldn't possibly have heard, but somehow knew word for word. Celeste never looked up from her sewing. Her face remained placid, serene. But in the dimming light, if someone had been watching closely, and no one ever watched Celeste closely if they could help it, they might have seen the faintest curve touch her lips. That night, after the lamps were extinguished and the quarters fell into the restless silence of exhausted sleep, Celeste rose from her bed. She moved like smoke through the darkness, past the sleeping forms of the other slaves, out into the thick summer night. The main house loomed ahead, its windows dark except for one, Thomas Whitmore's study, where lamplight still flickered behind heavy curtains. She didn't approach the house. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked to the edge of the tobacco fields, where the crops stood tall and ready for harvest, representing Whitmore's entire fortune for the year. She stood there for a long moment, her face tilted up to the moon, her expression unreadable. Then she knelt and placed something small among the tobacco plants, a folded paper, weighted down with a stone. On it, written in a hand that would be recognized by several prominent men in Virginia, were numbers. Just numbers, yields and dates and quantities that wouldn't match the official records Thomas would file with his cotton factors. Numbers that would raise questions, questions that would lead to investigations, investigations that would unravel everything. Celeste rose, brushed the dirt from her dress, and walked back toward the quarters. Behind her, the tobacco swayed in the night breeze, keeping its new secret until the time came to reveal it. In his study, Thomas Whitmore stared at another letter that had appeared on his desk. He didn't remember seeing it there before his last glass of whiskey. His blood ran cold as he read words that detailed his private dealings, his hidden accounts, his desperate borrowing from men who didn't forgive debts. At the bottom, in handwriting, he recognized from ledgers and household lists was a single line. "Every secret has a price, Master Whitmore. Have you paid yours?" He looked up at the window, his reflection staring back at him, pale, terrified, already haunted. And though he couldn't see her, though she was safely back in the quarters among the other slaves, Thomas could swear he felt her smile in the darkness. The game had begun, and Celeste had never lost. Dawn broke over Rosewood Plantation with the kind of oppressive heat that made breathing feel like drowning. Thomas Whitmore hadn't slept. He sat at his desk, surrounded by papers, desperately trying to reconstruct his accounts, to find some way to hide what couldn't be hidden. The letter lay before him like a death sentence. His hands, which had once commanded ships and slaves and the futures of lesser men, now shook so badly he could barely hold his pen. A knock at the study door made him jump, scattering papers across the mahogany surface. "What is it?" "The overseer, sir," came his house slave's voice, "says there's been an incident in the fields." Thomas wanted to ignore it, to barricade himself in his study and pretend the world outside had ceased to exist. But plantation business couldn't wait on personal crises. He forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady, and followed the slave outside. Josiah Crenshaw, the overseer, stood near the tobacco fields with his hat in his hands, never a good sign. The man was built like an ox and twice as mean, known throughout 3 counties for his liberal use of the whip. But this morning his weathered face looked pale. "What's the problem, Crenshaw?" The overseer gestured toward the tobacco. "Found something in the fields this morning. Thought you should see it before the hands do." Thomas followed him between the rows of tall plants until Crenshaw stopped and pointed. There, partially hidden among the leaves, was a small, cleared space. In its center sat a circle of stones, and within that circle, arranged with disturbing precision, were personal items. A monogrammed handkerchief Thomas had lost months ago, a cufflink he'd thought stolen, scraps of paper covered in what looked like his own handwriting. "What the hell is this?" Thomas whispered. "Looks like conjure work to me," Crenshaw said, his voice low. "Slave magic, root work." "Don't be ridiculous, that's superstitious nonsense." But even as Thomas said it, his skin prickled with an ancestral fear that had nothing to do with reason. He'd heard the stories, every white man in the South had, about slaves who could curse you with a look, who could write your name on a slip of paper and make your life unravel like pulled thread. Educated men dismissed such things as primitive folklore. But educated men also locked their doors at night and avoided the swamps where the old ones gathered. "Who found this?" Thomas demanded. "I did, sir. Before dawn. Wanted to check the crop before the hands came out." Crenshaw shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "But, sir, if I may, there's been talk in the quarters about that girl, Celeste." Thomas's jaw clenched. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that makes the other slaves nervous. They say she's got a gift, that she can read and write better than most white folks, that she knows things she shouldn't know." Crenshaw lowered his voice further. "Some say she's got the sight, that she can see a man's sins just by looking at him. She's a slave, Crenshaw, an illiterate slave who cleans and mends, nothing more." But the overseer's expression suggested he didn't believe that any more than Thomas did. "With respect, sir, I've been managing slaves for 20 years. I know trouble when I see it. And that girl is trouble wrapped in a pretty package. You want my advice? Sell her, today, before whatever this is," he gestured at the circle of stones, "gets worse." Thomas wanted to argue, to assert his authority, to pretend he was still in control of his own plantation. Instead, he found himself nodding. "Find a buyer, someone far from here, Alabama maybe, or Texas." "Yes, sir." Crenshaw's relief was visible. "I'll send word to the traders in Richmond." As the overseer walked away, Thomas knelt beside the circle of stones. His hands trembled as he reached for the papers bearing his handwriting. They were fragments of his private correspondence, pieces he'd burned in his fireplace months ago. How were they here? Who had reconstructed them? A shadow fell across him, and Thomas looked up sharply. Celeste stood at the edge of the tobacco field, a bucket of water balanced on her shoulder. She wasn't looking at him directly, but he felt the weight of her attention like a physical thing. "Morning, Master Whitmore," she said, her voice melodious and empty of any emotion. "Beautiful day for the harvest. What are you doing here?" "Bringing water to the field hands, sir, like I'm told." She tilted her head slightly, and for just a moment her eyes met his. They were completely black in the early morning light, depthless. "Is something wrong?" Thomas scrambled to his feet, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he looked, kneeling in the dirt. "Get back to the quarters." "Yes, sir." She lowered her eyes again, the picture of obedience, but as she turned to leave, she paused. "Master Whitmore, I heard you might be thinking of selling some of us. I just want you to know," her voice was still perfectly respectful, perfectly calm, "that would be a mistake." And the words hung in the air like a threat, and a promise rolled into one. Before Thomas could respond, she walked away, her movements fluid and unhurried. He watched her go, feeling something cold settle in his chest. She knew. Somehow, she always knew. Inside the plantation house, Margaret Whitmore sat in her morning room with 3 other planters' wives, pretending to work on embroidery while trading gossip. The women had been coming more frequently lately, drawn by the delicious scandal of Morrison's suicide and the whispered rumors connecting it to other recent misfortunes among Virginia's plantation elite. "I heard," Elizabeth Thornton said, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper, "that Morrison had been keeping 2 sets of books, one for his creditors and one with the real numbers. When the real ones came to light—" "How did they come to light?" Margaret interrupted, her needle pausing mid-stitch. The women exchanged glances. Finally, Eleanor Pemberton spoke, her plump face drawn with worry. "There was a letter, anonymous, sent to his primary creditor in Richmond. It detailed every discrepancy, every false claim. They say whoever wrote it had access to both sets of books. An inside man, then," Margaret concluded, "a clerk or business partner." "That's what they thought at first." Eleanor leaned closer. "But the handwriting was feminine, educated but feminine, the kind of script you'd see in a lady's correspondence." Margaret felt a small tremor of unease. "Are you suggesting Morrison's wife?" No, she was devastated. Besides, she couldn't have known the details. No proper woman involves herself in her husband's business to that degree. Eleanor's voice dropped even lower. "But he did own quite a few house slaves, young ones, pretty ones." The implications hung heavy in the perfumed air of the morning room. Every woman there knew what happened between masters and female slaves, though none would speak of it directly. It was the great unmentioned reality of their world, the mixed-race children who appeared in the quarters, the slave women who moved through the houses with downcast eyes and bitter knowledge, the wives who pretended not to notice their husbands' midnight visits to the cabins. "That's absurd," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Slaves can't read or write. It's illegal to even teach them." "Most can't," Elizabeth agreed. "But there are always exceptions. My Charles says there's one at the Montfort place who can do basic figures. And you remember the Caruthers incident? That boy who forged a pass and made it almost to Pennsylvania?" Margaret's needlework forgotten, she thought about the slaves at Rosewood. Most were field hands, illiterate and exhausted. But the house slaves, Sarah could count and knew letters. Old Ruth had once mentioned remembering her mother reading from the Bible back before the stricter laws. And Celeste, who moved through the house like she belonged there. Celeste, who Thomas had become so strange about. Celeste, who Margaret had once glimpsed standing in Thomas's study doorway. Her posture too straight, her expression too knowing for a woman who was supposed to be property. "Margaret?" Eleanor's voice cut through her thoughts. "You've gone quite pale." "It's the heat," Margaret said quickly, setting aside her embroidery. "Ladies, I'm afraid I need to rest. This weather is quite oppressive." The women left in a flutter of parasols and knowing looks. They sensed scandal the way sharks sensed blood. Margaret waited until their carriages disappeared down the oak-lined drive before she went looking for her husband. She found him in his study, surrounded by papers and reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. His eyes were bloodshot, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. He looked like a man on the edge of collapse. "Thomas, we need to talk about the slaves." He didn't look up from his ledgers. "Not now, Margaret." "Yes, now. Specifically, we need to talk about Celeste." His pen stopped moving. The silence stretched between them, thick with things unspoken. "What about her?" His voice was carefully neutral. Margaret moved closer, studying her husband's face. She'd been married to him for 15 years, had borne him 3 children, had stood beside him through business troubles and social challenges. She knew when he was hiding something. Where did she come from? What? Celeste. Where did we acquire her? I've been trying to remember and I can't. Was she born here? Did we buy her? I have no memory of her arriving. Thomas's hand moved to his desk drawer, then stopped. She came from the Beaumont place 5 years ago, part of an estate settlement. And before that? I don't know, Margaret. Does it matter? She's a slave. We own her papers. Show me. What? Show me her papers, her bill of sale, her documentation. Margaret's voice hardened. Because I've been hearing very disturbing things today, Thomas, about Morrison's death, about letters and secrets. And your behavior lately suggests you're terrified of something or someone. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain it to me. Explain why you won't allow that girl near our guests. Explain why you drink yourself unconscious every night. Explain why Josiah Crenshaw looks at you with pity. Margaret's voice rose. And explain why, when I went to put away your coat this morning, I found a letter warning you about a slave girl who destroys men. Thomas's face crumbled. For a moment he looked like he might confess everything. The extortion, the fear, the dark certainty that Celeste knew every sin he'd ever committed and was slowly, methodically destroying him with that knowledge. But then his pride reasserted itself. I'm selling her. Crenshaw is finding a buyer. Good. Margaret turned toward the door, then paused. Thomas, whatever you've done, whatever she knows, it won't end with selling her. You know that, don't you? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. Some debts couldn't be sold off to Alabama or Texas, some secrets couldn't be buried deep enough, and some women, once they smiled at you with knowledge in their eyes, never really left, even after they were gone. The slave trader arrived 3 days later, rolling up to Rosewood in a wagon that stank of sweat and misery. His name was Nathaniel Crow, and he specialized in what the genteel plantation owners called difficult stock. Slaves who'd attempted escape, who showed signs of rebellion, or who'd simply made their masters nervous. He asked few questions and paid in cash, which made him popular among men desperate to disappear their problems. Thomas met him in the drive, eager to conclude the transaction before he lost his nerve. She's healthy, young, no signs of disease or trouble, good worker. Crow spat tobacco juice onto the crushed oyster shell path. If she's such a good worker, why you selling her? Private reasons, they always are. Crow's eyes, small and cunning in his weathered face, studied Thomas with the kind of assessment that made wealthy men uncomfortable. Let me see her. Sarah was sent to fetch Celeste from the quarters. Thomas waited in the shade of the house, his heart hammering. Part of him expected her to refuse to come, to expose him right there in front of Crow and the assembled house slaves. But after a few minutes, she appeared, walking calmly between Sarah and Josiah Crenshaw, her face expressionless. She wore a simple grey dress, her hair covered with a clean scarf. In the bright afternoon sun, her beauty was even more striking, the kind that made men do foolish things. But it was the way she carried herself that caught Crow's attention. Not the broken shuffle of a properly beaten slave, but with her head up, shoulders back, eyes forward. This her? Yes. Crow circled Celeste slowly, evaluating her like livestock. Open your mouth, girl. Let me see your teeth. Celeste didn't move. She simply stood there, looking straight ahead, her face carved from stone. I said, open your mouth. Crow reached toward her face. Don't touch me. The words were spoken quietly, almost gently, but they landed like a thunderclap. Crow's hand froze mid-air. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. What did you say? Crow's voice was dangerous now. Celeste turned her head slowly to look at him, and Thomas saw the trader take an involuntary step backward. I said, don't touch me. I'll show you my teeth if you ask politely, but you don't put your hands on me without permission. The compound had gone deathly silent. Every slave within hearing distance had stopped working to witness this impossible moment. A slave woman dictating terms to a white man. Thomas opened his mouth to intervene, to prevent the beating that would surely come, but Crow surprised him. The trader laughed, a harsh bark of sound. Got spirit, this one. I like that. Them fancy places in New Orleans pay good money for pretty ones with fire. He stepped back, giving Celeste space. All right, girl. Show me your teeth, please. Celeste smiled then, not with warmth or submission, but with something that made Thomas's skin crawl. She opened her mouth, displayed perfect white teeth, then closed it and returned her gaze to the middle distance. She can read? Crow asked Thomas. No, absolutely not. You sure about that? Thomas hesitated a moment too long. Crow nodded slowly, understanding passing across his face. I see. Well, now that changes things. Smart slaves go for less, generally. Too much trouble, but the right buyer. He named a price. Half what Thomas had hoped for. That's robbery. That's the market, friend. Take it or keep her. But I'll tell you straight, you got yourself a weapon here, not a slave. Weapons got a way of going off when you least expect it. Best to disarm before someone gets hurt. Thomas thought about Morrison hanging in his barn, about Judge Bartholomew's sudden fall from grace, about his own sleepless nights, and the letters that appeared like conjured things in places they shouldn't be. Deal. Good choice. Crow pulled out a leather purse and counted bills. I'll take her now. Now? No point waiting. I got 2 more stops before Richmond, and I like to be in town before dark. Less trouble that way. Crow looked at Celeste. You got anything to collect, girl? Personal items? No, sir, Celeste said softly. I don't own anything. The words should have been powerless. Slaves, by definition, owned nothing, not even themselves. But the way she said it, with that slight emphasis on own, made it sound like a threat rather than an acknowledgement of her status. Thomas handed over her papers, the forged documents he'd commissioned 5 years ago when she'd first appeared at Rosewood, under circumstances he'd never fully explained to Margaret. Crow glanced at them, nodded, and tucked them into his coat. All right, then. Say your goodbyes, girl. Not that you'll be missed much, I'm guessing. Celeste turned to face Thomas for the first time since her arrival in the yard. Their eyes met, and he saw something flicker in her dark gaze. Not hatred exactly, but a kind of profound knowledge that made him feel transparent, like she could see every rotten thing he'd ever done, every lie he'd ever told, every secret he'd buried. Goodbye, Master Whitmore, she said, her voice carrying across the silent yard. I hope you sleep better now. But the way she said hope made it clear she knew he wouldn't, that selling her off would change nothing. The damage was done. The seeds were planted, and whatever grew from them would be his to harvest. Crow gestured toward his wagon, where 2 other slaves, a teenage boy and a middle-aged woman, were already chained in the back. Up you go. Celeste climbed into the wagon with fluid grace, arranging herself on the rough wooden bench as if it were a throne. Crow locked the chain around her ankle, then climbed onto the driver's seat. He tipped his hat to Thomas. Pleasure doing business. As the wagon rolled down the oak-lined drive, Thomas watched Celeste's straight back recede into the distance. She never looked back, never called out, never gave any sign that leaving bothered her at all. And somehow, that was more terrifying than any curse or threat could have been, because it meant she'd already won. The journey to Richmond took 3 days, winding through the green hills and thick forests of Virginia. Crow stopped each night at stations, rough buildings where slave traders could stable their human cargo safely, and during the days he said little to his passengers beyond barked orders to drink water and relieve themselves at scheduled stops. But on the 2nd day, as they rolled through a particularly isolated stretch of road, Celeste spoke from the back of the wagon. Mr. Crow, may I ask you a question? The trader glanced back, surprised. Most slaves knew better than to initiate conversation. What? You've been in this business a long time, haven't you? 20 years. Then you've seen it all. You know which slaves are trouble and which aren't. You know the signs. Celeste shifted slightly, the chain around her ankle clinking. What sign did I give off? Crow was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. You want the truth? I always want the truth. It ain't one thing. It's a feeling. I look at some slaves, I see broken, I see beat down, I see folks who've accepted their place. He spit over the side of the wagon. I look at you, I see someone playing a part, good at it too, but playing nonetheless. And that makes me dangerous. It makes you smart. And smart slaves are the most dangerous kind because they know how to wait, how to watch, how to learn what they need to learn. Crow glanced back again. Whitmore was scared of you. Really scared. Men like that don't sell off valuable property without good reason. Maybe I gave him a reason. I'm sure you did. Crow's voice held a note of grudging respect. Word of advice, though? New Orleans is a different world. Lots of pretty yellow girls down there, lots of fancy houses. You play your cards right, you might end up in one of them nice places serving tea to rich French ladies. Play 'em wrong. He let the sentence hang. I always play them right, Celeste said softly. The teenage boy chained next to her, who'd been silent the entire journey, whispered, How you so calm? Ain't you scared? Celeste turned to look at him. His name was Samuel, she'd learned. Sold away from his mother for stealing a chicken. His eyes were wide with fear and admiration. Fear is a choice, Samuel, so is power. Most people think you need to own things to have power. Property, money, freedom. She rattled her chain deliberately. But the most powerful thing you can own is knowledge. Knowledge of how things really work. Knowledge of what people don't want others to know. Knowledge of how to wait until exactly the right moment to use what you know. You talking about revenge? I'm talking about justice. There's a difference. The older woman chained on Samuel's other side, who'd given her name as Ruth, spoke up in a raspy voice. Child, justice and revenge look mighty similar when you're on the receiving end, and white folks got long memories. You hurt them, they come for you eventually. Maybe, Celeste acknowledged, but which hurts worse? The whip on your back, or watching everything you built crumble because you built it on sand and lies? A beating ends. Shame lasts forever. Ruth studied her for a long moment. You done something terrible, haven't you? Something that gonna follow you? No, Celeste said, her voice distant. I haven't done anything at all. That's what makes it perfect. They destroyed themselves. I just knew which stones to overturn so the truth could crawl out from underneath. That night, at a station outside of Petersburg, Crow came to the locked room where the slaves were kept. He held a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the rough walls. You, he said to Celeste, come with me. Samuel grabbed her hand, his eyes terrified. Don't go. It's all right. Celeste squeezed his fingers gently, then stood and followed Crow out into the main room of the station. She expected the worst, expected him to exercise the privileges that traders often claimed over female slaves in their custody. Instead, he gestured to a rough wooden table where a bottle and 2 cups sat. Sit, she sat, wary. Crow poured amber liquid into both cups, pushed one toward her, then settled into his own chair with a groan. You're wondering why I brought you out here? Yes, sir. Don't sir me. We both know you don't mean it. He drained his cup, poured another. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about knowledge being power, about stones and truth. He leaned forward. I want to know what you did to Whitmore. Real story. Why? Because in 20 years, I never seen a man so desperate to be rid of a slave, and I never seen a slave so calm about being sold. There's a story there, and I collect stories like other men collect stamps. Celeste was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Then she smiled, that same unsettling smile that had haunted Thomas Whitmore's nightmares. I'll tell you, she said, but you won't like it. Try me. Thomas Whitmore bought me when I was 15 from a broker in Charleston. I was part of an estate sale. My previous master had died under suspicious circumstances. The official story was heart failure. But there were rumors about documents that had gone missing, about secrets that had been exposed. She paused. I learned to read from that master's daughter. She thought she was being Christian, teaching a slave child letters. She didn't realize she was creating something dangerous. What happened to her? Nothing. She was kind. I made sure nothing happened to her. Celeste took a small sip from her cup, barely wetting her lips. But Whitmore, he touched me the second week I was at Rosewood, in the study. He thought because he owned my papers, he owned my consent. Crow's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or distant memory of his own compromised humanity. So I started watching, listening, learning. I learned which floorboards creaked, which walls were thin, which windows stayed open at night. I learned where he kept his business papers, his private correspondence, his account books, and I learned that Thomas Whitmore was a fraud. Fraud how? He'd inherited debt, not wealth. The plantation was mortgaged 3 times over. The crops barely covered his expenses. He was borrowing from everyone, banks, private lenders, other planters, and using creative accounting to hide it. He was one bad harvest away from losing everything. So you exposed him? No. Celeste's smile widened. That would have been too obvious, too traceable. Instead, I made copies, little bits and pieces of his papers, transcribed in my own hand and hidden away, and I waited. I became the perfect slave, obedient, quiet, invisible, until I heard him talking about selling my friend Sarah downriver because he needed money. That's when I sent the first letter. To who? His primary creditor. Just a gentle hint that the accounts might not be accurate, that maybe an audit would be illuminating. She leaned back. The creditor started asking questions. Whitmore got nervous, made mistakes, started drinking. The more he drank, the more mistakes he made. And I kept watching, kept copying, kept making sure his lies stayed just visible enough to see if you looked closely. Crow shook his head slowly. You didn't destroy him. You made him destroy himself. Exactly. And the beauty of it is, there's no proof I did anything. No letters in my handwriting to be found because I burned them after copying. No evidence of me accessing his study because I was always supposed to be there cleaning. I'm just a slave who knows how to read and write. There are dozens of us, hundreds maybe, could be any of them. But it was you. Was it? Celeste's voice was pure innocence. How can you prove that, Mr. Crow? How can anyone prove that? I'm property. I don't even exist as a real person in the eyes of the law. How can someone who doesn't exist commit a crime? They sat in silence, the lantern flickering between them. Finally, Crow spoke. You're going to do it again, aren't you? In New Orleans, or wherever you end up. You're going to keep doing this. I'm going to survive, Celeste corrected. If that means watching powerful men destroy themselves with their own corruption and cruelty, well, that seems like divine justice to me. Crow stood, ending the conversation. As Celeste rose to return to the locked room, he caught her arm gently. One more question. Yes? Was it worth it? All that revenge, all that careful planning. Did it make you feel better? Did it heal what he'd done to you? Celeste looked at him with those dark, fathomless eyes. No, Mr. Crow, it didn't heal anything. Revenge never does. But it made sure he'd never forget me. That every time his world crumbles a little more, and it will keep crumbling, he'll see my face. He'll remember the girl he thought he owned. And he'll know deep down that some people are never truly slaves. Some of us are just waiting for the moment to prove it. She walked back to the locked room, leaving Crow standing alone with his bottle and his thoughts. And for the first time in 20 years, the slave trader felt something he couldn't quite name, a mixture of awe and terror at what human beings were capable of when pushed far enough, when survival required not strength but patience, not weapons but witness. He drained his cup and wondered if the men who bought Celeste in New Orleans would realize what they were purchasing. Probably not until it was too late. They never did. Richmond rose from the James River like a promise and a threat, its church spires and factory smokestacks piercing the hazy Virginia sky. The slave market sat near Shockoe Bottom, where the stink of human commerce mixed with the smell of tobacco and river mud. This was where the internal trade did its brutal business, where families were separated, where the enslaved from Virginia were sold south to fuel cotton and sugar plantations that consumed bodies like the mills consumed coal. Nathaniel Crow's wagon rolled past the auction blocks and coffles of chained slaves waiting for sale. He pulled up instead to a large brick building with iron-barred windows, a private holding facility for specialty sales. These were transactions done quietly for clients who wanted particular types of slaves and were willing to pay premium prices for discretion. "This is where we part ways," Crow told his cargo. "Samuel, you're going to a tobacco plantation near Lynchburg. Ruth, there's a family in Charlottesville needs a cook, and you," he looked at Celeste, "you got special arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Samuel asked, his voice cracking. "The kind that ain't your business, boy." Crow's tone was harsh, but his eyes found Celeste with something like apology. "She'll be fine. Better than fine, probably. Wish I could say the same for the fool who buys her." Inside the holding facility, the slaves were separated into different rooms. Celeste found herself alone in a surprisingly clean chamber with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a dress hanging from a peg. Not the rough homespun she was used to, but a quality cotton dress in deep blue, the kind a house servant in a wealthy home might wear. An elderly black woman entered, carrying a brush and comb. She looked at Celeste with sharp, assessing eyes. "I'm Hattie. I get the girls ready for the special sales. You know what special sales means?" "I can guess." "Can you now?" Hattie circled Celeste slowly. "You're prettier than most, I'll give you that, but pretty ain't enough for the gentleman who's coming to look at you. He wants refined, educated. Can you read?" "Yes." "French?" "No, pity. The fancy houses in New Orleans prefer girls who speak French." Hattie gestured to the dress. "Put that on. Wash first. I'll be back to fix your hair." When Hattie returned, Celeste was clean and dressed, the blue fabric making her skin glow like polished mahogany. Hattie worked on her hair with practiced efficiency, arranging it in a style that was sophisticated without being too elaborate. The mark of a valuable slave who knew her place but could move in refined spaces. "You scared?" Hattie asked as she worked. "Should I be? Most girls are. Heading to New Orleans to the fancy houses? It ain't what you think. Some men, they want slaves who can serve at parties, pour tea, make them look cultured. Others," she paused, "others want something else, someone to show off, someone to use. You understand?" "I understand that men always want something they don't deserve." Hattie's hands stilled. "You got a mouth on you. Better learn to keep it shut, or you won't last long where you're going." "I've lasted this long." "This long?" Hattie laughed bitterly. "Child, you can't be more than 20. You ain't lived long enough to know nothing." "I'm 21, Celeste said quietly, "and I've learned that survival isn't about age. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to bow your head and when to lift it, when to be invisible and when to be seen." Hattie met her eyes in the small mirror on the wall. "You ain't ordinary, are you? No one who survives is ordinary." Before Hattie could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that announced wealth and authority. Hattie quickly straightened Celeste's collar and whispered, "Be smart, child. Whoever this is, they paying good money. That means they expecting something in return. Figure out what that is before they do." The door opened and a white man entered, middle-aged, impeccably dressed in a grey suit that spoke of New Orleans tailors and old money. He had the kind of face that appeared trustworthy, even kind, but Celeste had learned to look past faces to the truth beneath. His eyes, as they swept over her, held calculation and possession. "This is her?" he asked Hattie. "Yes, sir, Master Rousseau. This is the one Mr. Crow spoke of." Rousseau. The name stirred something in Celeste's memory. She'd heard it before in Thomas Whitmore's study. Rousseau was a cotton broker, one of the powerful merchants who controlled the flow of goods and credit between the plantation south and the factories of the north. A man with connections that stretched from Virginia to Louisiana, from banks in Richmond to auction houses in New Orleans. "Stand!" Rousseau commanded. Celeste stood, her posture straight but not defiant. She'd learned this balance over years, pride without rebellion, dignity without challenge. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds before lowering her gaze to a point just past his shoulder, long enough to show intelligence, short enough to show respect. "You can read?" "Yes, sir." "Write?" "Yes, sir." "How did you acquire these skills?" "I was taught by my previous master's daughter, sir. She believed it would make me more valuable." It was the story she'd practiced, the lie that was just believable enough. Better than the truth, that she'd learned her letters from scraps of newspaper used to wrap food, from books left carelessly open, from patient observation through windows, while white children received lessons she was forbidden. Rousseau reached into his coat and pulled out a slim, leather-bound book. He opened it to a random page and held it out to her. "Read." Celeste took the book carefully, her hands steady. It was poetry. Wordsworth, she recognized after a moment. She read the passage smoothly, her voice clear and measured, pronouncing each word with precision. When she finished, she closed the book and handed it back. Impressive. Rousseau's expression remained neutral, but she sensed his satisfaction. "Can you serve at a formal dinner, understand wines and courses?" "I can learn whatever you require, sir." "Do you speak back? Cause trouble?" Here was the moment of truth. Celeste could play the perfect submissive slave, the woman who'd been broken to the bit, but something in Rousseau's eyes told her he wasn't looking for broken. He was looking for intelligent but controllable, a much more dangerous game. "I speak when spoken to, sir. I cause no trouble unless I'm given trouble to solve." The corner of Rousseau's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Clever answer. You'll do well in New Orleans, assuming you understand the rules." "I operate several business establishments there, including a social club for gentlemen of means. I need someone who can manage the house staff, ensure everything runs smoothly, and present the kind of refined atmosphere my clients expect. Do you understand what I'm offering?" "I understand you're offering me a position of responsibility, sir." "With responsibility comes expectation. You will not embarrass me. You will not steal. You will not spread gossip or share what you overhear in private conversations. The gentlemen who patronize my establishment value discretion above all else." His voice hardened. "Betray that discretion, and I promise you'll regret it." "I value discretion as well, sir." Rousseau studied her for a long moment, and Celeste wondered if he could see past her carefully constructed facade to the calculation beneath. If he understood that a woman who valued discretion also knew the power of strategic revelation. But whatever he saw, it satisfied him. "The price is steep," he told Hattie, "but I'll take her. Have the papers prepared." As Rousseau left to complete the transaction, Hattie exhaled slowly. "You just got bought by one of the richest men in Louisiana. You ought to be relieved." "Should I?" "Most girls would be. Rousseau's places are clean, well run. You won't be worked to death in the fields or sold off on a whim. If you're smart, and Lord knows you seem smart, you could live comfortable enough." "Comfortable," Celeste repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what we're calling it?" Hattie's expression hardened. "Child, I've been in this business 40 years. I've seen slaves beaten to death for spilling water. I've seen children sold away from their mothers for crying too loud. I've seen women used up and thrown away like broken tools. So yes, I call working in a fine house in New Orleans comfortable compared to that. You got a problem with my vocabulary? No, ma'am. I apologize. Celeste's voice softened. You're right. I should be grateful. But even as she said it, even as she bowed her head in contrition, Celeste's mind was already working, already cataloguing information about Rousseau, his wealth, his businesses, his need for discretion. Already understanding that a gentleman's social club was just another name for a place where powerful men gathered to make deals, share secrets, and let their guard down among people they thought were too insignificant to matter. A place where a smart slave who knew how to listen and watch and remember could learn everything worth knowing about everyone worth knowing. Hattie left her alone with instructions to rest before the journey south, but Celeste didn't rest. She stood at the barred window, looking out over Richmond's rooftops toward the river that would eventually carry her to New Orleans. Somewhere behind her, back at Rosewood Plantation, Thomas Whitmore was probably still awake, still drinking, still haunted by what she'd done, or more accurately, by what he'd done to himself with her as witness. And ahead of her, in a city she'd never seen, among men whose names she didn't yet know, lay more secrets waiting to be discovered. More powerful men who thought their money and status made them untouchable. More opportunities to prove that the most dangerous weapon wasn't a sword or a gun, but knowledge carefully hoarded and strategically deployed. Celeste pressed her palm against the cold iron bars and smiled at her reflection in the window glass. She looked like a woman in chains. But chains were just another form of misdirection. They made people underestimate you, made them think bars and locks could contain something that had already learned to move freely in the spaces between truth and lies. 3 days later, she would board a steamship bound for New Orleans. She would stand on the deck in her blue dress, watching Virginia disappear behind her, and she would not look back. There was no point in looking back. The past was done. Thomas Whitmore and Rosewood Plantation were just the prologue. The real story, the story of what a slave woman could do with enough patience, intelligence, and the secrets of powerful men, was just beginning. And in New Orleans, where Creole culture mixed with American ambition, where slavery and freedom existed in complicated proximities, where fortunes were made and lost on cotton prices and railroad speculation, and the kinds of deals men made in private rooms while slaves served their whiskey and heard everything. In New Orleans, Celeste would learn exactly how much power she could wield while wearing chains. The answer would terrify them all. New Orleans in 1850 was a city of contradictions, wrapped in humidity and draped with Spanish moss. Cathedral bells competed with auction calls, French opera mingled with slave spirituals, and the scent of jasmine couldn't quite mask the underlying stench of commerce built on human bondage. The Mississippi churned past the city like America itself, powerful, unstoppable, carrying everything in its current whether it wanted to go or not. The steamship from Richmond docked at the busy port, and Celeste descended the gangplank with 4 other newly purchased slaves, all bound for different destinations in Rousseau's business empire. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back and a mind full of carefully catalogued observations from the journey south. A well-dressed black man waited at the dock, holding a placard with Rousseau's name. His freedom papers were visible in his breast pocket, a deliberate display that marked him as different from the property he'd come to collect. His name was Henri, and he spoke with the lilting accent of New Orleans's free Creole population. "You're Celeste?" "Yes. I manage Mr. Rousseau's household staff. You'll come with me." He gestured to a fine carriage, better than anything she'd ridden in Virginia. As they climbed in, Henri studied her with eyes that were kind but wary. "Mr. Rousseau has high expectations. You understand that?" "I understand that men with power always have high expectations." Henri's eyebrow arched. "You got education and sass. That combination can serve you well or get you killed, depending on how smart you are about when to use which." "I've survived this long. Virginia isn't New Orleans. Henri warned as the carriage rolled through the crowded streets. Down here, the rules are different. We got free people of color who own slaves. We got slaves who live in their own homes and run businesses. We got masters who treat their property like family, and family who treats their property like animals. Nothing is simple here. Nothing is what it looks like. Celeste watched the city pass by the window. Grand houses with iron lacework balconies, bustling markets where languages mixed like ingredients in gumbo, women in elaborate dresses walking past men in chains. And Mr. Rousseau? What is he? Careful. That's what he is. Careful about his reputation, careful about his money, careful about who knows what about him. Henri's voice dropped lower. The Maison Rousseau, that's the club you'll be working at. It's where the powerful men of this city come to be themselves, to talk freely, to make deals they can't make in daylight. Your job is to make that possible while being invisible. Can you be invisible? When I need to be. The Maison Rousseau occupied a 3-story building in the French Quarter, its exterior elegant but understated. Henri led her through a side entrance into a world of polished wood and crystal chandeliers, of thick carpets and oil paintings, of wealth displayed with the confidence of those who never questioned their right to it. The staff quarters were on the 3rd floor, small but clean rooms, better than the slave cabins at Rosewood. Henri showed her to a narrow chamber with a bed, a dresser and a window overlooking the street. You'll share this floor with the other house staff. Julia runs the kitchen, Baptiste handles the wine cellar, and Marie manages the entertainment rooms. They'll teach you the routine. What's my position? Assistant to the hostess. You'll help ensure guests are comfortable, manage the servers, keep everything flowing smoothly during events. Henri paused. And you'll be present in the private rooms. Present how? The gentlemen like to have someone pour their drinks, light their cigars, refresh their refreshments during their meetings. Someone who's there but not there, if you understand. Someone who might as well be furniture for all the attention they pay to whether she has ears, understanding dawned. Celeste had been purchased not just as a house slave, but as a living piece of espionage. A woman who would be present for conversations that could never be repeated, because officially she didn't matter enough to be remembered. I understand. Good. Henri handed her a folded uniform, a black dress with a white apron, more formal than her traveling clothes. Mr. Rousseau will want to see you this evening. There's a gathering tonight. Important clients. You'll observe, stay silent, and report to him afterward about anything unusual you notice. He wants me to spy for him. He wants you to protect his interests by understanding his guests. There's a difference. Henri moved toward the door, then stopped. Celeste, the men who come here, they're not Virginia planters playing at wealth. They're serious people with serious money and serious connections, railroad magnates, cotton factors, shipping merchants, politicians. They will ruin you without thinking if they suspect you're a threat. So whatever cleverness you used back in Virginia, whatever games you played, you need to forget them. Here, you serve. That's all. Understand? Celeste nodded, her face perfectly serene. But inside, her mind was already racing. Henri had just confirmed what she'd suspected, that Rousseau's club was exactly the kind of place where secrets gathered like morning dew, where powerful men felt safe enough to be honest, where the right person in the right place at the right time could learn everything worth knowing about how the South's economy really worked. Henri was warning her to be careful. What he didn't understand was that Celeste had spent 6 years learning to be exactly this kind of careful. Patient careful. Strategic careful. The kind of careful that looked like obedience while cataloguing every useful detail for future use. That evening, dressed in her black uniform with her hair pinned up tight, Celeste descended to the main floor of the Maison Rousseau. The building had been transformed, candles blazing in every room, a quartet playing Mozart in the parlor, the smell of expensive cigars and French cologne mixing in the warm air. Men in expensive suits moved through the space like sharks in familiar waters, their voices low and confident. Julia, the head cook, a free woman of color with skin the color of honey and eyes that missed nothing, pulled Celeste aside in the kitchen. "First time working a real gathering?" "I've served before." "Not like this, you haven't. These aren't planters drinking cheap whiskey and bragging about their cotton yields. These are men who control whether that cotton even gets to market. Men who decide which railroads get built and which banks survive. Men who are probably planning the next war right now in our parlor." Julia thrust a tray of crystal glasses into Celeste's hands. "You stay quiet, you stay alert, and if anyone puts hands on you, you come get me or Henri immediately. Mr. Rousseau runs a respectable house. He won't tolerate his property being damaged." Property. The word stung, even though Celeste had heard it 10,000 times. But Julia saw the flash in her eyes and softened her voice. I know what we are to them, but Mr. Rousseau is better than most, and this life is better than most. Hold on to that." Celeste took the tray and moved into the main parlor, where 20 men had gathered in small clusters. She circulated smoothly, offering drinks, refreshing glasses, her face a perfect mask of pleasant servility. And she listened. "Telling you, the compromise won't hold. California's admission as a free state changes everything. More concerned about the railroad speculation. I've heard rumors about Stewart's company. Cotton prices will rebound by harvest. Mark my words, if we can keep the abolitionists from stirring up trouble." At a table near the window, 4 men played cards while discussing business. One of them, a heavy-set man with mutton-chop whiskers, was speaking louder than the others. "Rousseau's got good timing, I'll say that. Opening this place right when we need somewhere to talk freely. Too many damned spies in the regular hotels." His companion, lean and grey-haired, nodded. "Still, I'm not comfortable discussing certain matters with slaves present." He glanced at Celeste as she refilled his glass. "They can't understand half of what we say," Mutton Chops dismissed. "And even if they could, who'd believe them? You going to take a slave's word over mine in any court?" "Not court I'm worried about. It's loose talk. You know what happened to Morrison up in Virginia? They say someone leaked his private business dealings, destroyed him." Celeste's hand remained perfectly steady as she poured, her face showing no reaction to hearing Morrison's name, but her pulse quickened. The story had spread beyond Virginia, was being used as a cautionary tale. And these men, for all their power, were nervous about exactly the thing she represented. The possibility that their secrets weren't as secure as they believed. "Morrison was a fool who kept sloppy records," another man interjected. "Besides, that was months ago, ancient history." But the grey-haired man wasn't convinced. "Ancient history has a way of repeating. All I'm saying is, we should be more careful. These slaves aren't as stupid as we pretend they are." "Then maybe you should stop talking and play your cards," Mutton Chops grumbled, effectively ending the conversation. Celeste moved on to the next cluster of guests, her mind cataloguing every name, every connection, every hint of business dealing or personal indiscretion. She was building a map, not of the city, but of power. Who owed whom, who hated whom, who was overextended financially and desperate for a rescue, who had political ambitions and would pay to keep certain facts quiet. By the end of the evening, after the last guests had departed and the staff was cleaning up, Rousseau summoned her to his private office. The room was all dark wood and leather, filled with the accoutrements of wealth. A globe, maps of shipping routes, ledgers bound in expensive calfskin. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk. It was unusual for a slave to be invited to sit in a master's presence, but Rousseau was pragmatic about his investment. "Tell me what you observed." Celeste had prepared her answer carefully. "The gentleman with the mutton-chop whiskers, I believe his name is Carlton, mentioned concerns about railroad speculation, specifically about someone named Stewart. The grey-haired man who played cards with him seems worried about security, about information being leaked. They discussed Morrison from Virginia as a cautionary tale. Rousseau's eyes sharpened. You remember names, yes, sir, and faces. And who seemed friendly with whom, who avoided whom, who drank too much and might say too much. Morrison, Rousseau repeated thoughtfully. I heard about that situation. Quite spectacular collapse. They never did determine who exposed his fraudulent accounting. His gaze fixed on Celeste with new intensity. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? This was the moment. Celeste could lie, could maintain her facade of simple competence. Or she could show Rousseau exactly what he'd bought. Not just an observant slave, but a weapon of the kind that powerful men always needed, but rarely recognized until it was pointed at them or their enemies. I know that men who keep poor records and treat their property badly sometimes find their records becoming public knowledge, sir. I know that justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources, and I know that a smart businessman protects his interests by making sure he has nothing to hide and by surrounding himself with people who understand the value of loyalty. The silence stretched between them like a wire drawn taut. Rousseau's face was unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Finally he spoke. You're either very brave or very stupid to admit that to me. I'm neither, sir. I'm practical. You purchased me knowing I was educated and observant. You brought me here to be your eyes and ears, in a room full of men who think themselves beyond observation. I'm simply clarifying that I understand my role completely. And what is your role, Celeste? To protect your interests by remembering everything and sharing it only with you. To be invisible when you need me invisible, and visible when you need me visible. To understand that my survival depends on your success, and to act accordingly. Rousseau leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Henri was right about you. You're dangerous, but perhaps dangerous is exactly what I need. He opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal, sliding it across the desk. Every gathering, you'll write down what you observed, names, conversations, concerns, alliances. You'll give this only to me, and you'll tell no one else about it. Not Henri, not Julia, not anyone. Understood? Yes, sir. Good. Rousseau stood, signaling the meeting was over. You may have been property in Virginia, Celeste, but here you're going to be something more useful. You're going to be my intelligence. And if you serve me well, I'll make sure you're treated better than any slave in this city. Celeste took the journal, feeling its weight in her hands. And if I don't serve you well, then you'll discover that New Orleans has swamps that never give up their dead. Rousseau's voice was pleasant, conversational. But you're too smart to let that happen, aren't you? Yes, sir. Much too smart. As she left his office and climbed the stairs to her small room, Celeste felt a familiar sensation, the thrill of a new game beginning, the pieces arranging themselves on the board, the rules becoming clear. Rousseau thought he'd found a useful tool. What he'd actually done was give her access, authority, and a reason to gather information about the most powerful men in Louisiana. She opened the journal to its first blank page and picked up the pen Rousseau had provided. In neat, careful handwriting, she began to record the evening's observations, every name, every connection, every hint of vulnerability or ambition or fear. But she also started a second list in her mind, one Rousseau would never see. A list of the information that would be useful, not to protect his interests, but to protect her own. Because Celeste had learned in Virginia that the key to survival wasn't loyalty to your master. It was making sure your master could never afford to get rid of you. And if that failed, it was making sure you knew enough about your master to take him down with you. Outside her window, New Orleans sprawled in all its contradictory glory, enslaved and free, cruel and beautiful, doomed and thriving. Somewhere in that tangle of streets and secrets, Celeste's future was waiting. Not freedom, perhaps, not justice, but something she'd learned to value even more. Power. The kind that came from knowing more than anyone suspected, remembering more than anyone wanted remembered, and being patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment to use what you knew. Thomas Whitmore had learned that lesson. Jacob Morrison had learned it too late. And now, the powerful men of New Orleans were about to enroll in the same school, taught by the same quiet teacher with the knowing smile. Class was in session, and Celeste never gave anyone a passing grade. 2 years passed like water flowing downhill, inevitable and occasionally turbulent, but always moving forward. By 1852, Celeste had become indispensable to the Maison Rousseau. She moved through the club with the precision of a chess player who'd memorized every possible move, anticipating needs before they were spoken, resolving problems before they became visible, and all the while accumulating information like a bank accumulated interest. Her journal for Rousseau had become several journals hidden in his private safe. But the real journal, the one she kept in her mind, never written down, never vulnerable to discovery, that one was worth more than any vault's contents. In it, she'd catalogued 2 years of secrets, indiscretions, business deals, political schemes, and personal weaknesses of Louisiana's most powerful men. She knew which cotton factor was skimming profits from his clients, which judge accepted bribes to rule in favor of certain railroad companies, which respected businessman kept a second family across town, which politician planned to run for Senate on a platform he didn't believe in, which ships carried cargo that never appeared on official manifests. And she knew, most importantly, how all these men were connected, the invisible web of debts and favors and blackmail that held Southern power together like spider silk, delicate-looking but surprisingly strong until you knew exactly which strand to cut. On a humid evening in August, the Maison Rousseau hosted its most significant gathering yet, a meeting of the Southern Commercial Convention, an informal assembly of the region's economic elite, planning their response to growing abolitionist pressure in the North. 30 men crowded into the main parlor, their voices sharp with anxiety, disguised as confidence. Celeste circulated with her tray of drinks, invisible as always. But tonight felt different, tense. The conversations had an edge of desperation. Can't let the North dictate our economic policy, talking about secession like it's a real possibility. Cotton is king, gentlemen, never forget that. At the center of the gathering, a man Celeste had never seen before commanded attention. He was younger than most present, perhaps 40, with the kind of face that appeared in history books, strong features, piercing eyes, the bearing of someone who expected to be obeyed. His name was Pierce Hamilton, and he owned more slaves than any other man in Louisiana. "The question isn't whether we can survive without the North," Hamilton was saying, his voice carrying across the room. "It's whether we're willing to fight for our way of life when they try to destroy it, because make no mistake, gentlemen, they will try. They're already trying." "Fight?" an older man sputtered. "You mean war?" "I mean protecting our interests by any means necessary. Our economy is built on a foundation that the North wants to dismantle. Our property rights are under constant assault. Our political power in Washington erodes every day." Hamilton's gaze swept the room. "We need to be prepared for the possibility that this union cannot hold." The men shifted uncomfortably. War talk was serious business, the kind that could brand you a traitor or a prophet depending on how the future unfolded. But Hamilton's confidence was magnetic, drawing them into his vision of Southern independence. Rousseau, standing near the bar, caught Celeste's eye and nodded slightly. She understood. Pay extra attention to Hamilton, remember everything he says, document this gathering with particular care. This was the kind of conversation that could be valuable later, for leverage or protection or profit. But as Celeste moved closer to refresh Hamilton's drink, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: genuine fear. Not fear of punishment or physical harm, but fear of the future Hamilton was describing. War would mean chaos. Chaos would mean opportunity for some, but devastation for the enslaved population caught between two armies fighting over whether they were property or people. "Thank you," Hamilton said absently as she poured whiskey into his glass. His eyes barely registered her presence. She was furniture, backdrop, nothing. Then he turned back to his audience. The Compromise of 1850 was supposed to settle these questions. Instead, it simply delayed the inevitable. "We need to start planning now for what comes after." "After what?" someone asked. "After the North pushes us too far and we're forced to respond. After we establish our own nation, our own economy, our own destiny." Hamilton's voice rose with the passion of a prophet. "And when we do, gentlemen, we'll need to ensure that our foundation remains strong. That means no wavering on the question of property rights, no concessions to abolitionists, no tolerance for anything that threatens the system that has made us prosperous." Celeste's hand remained steady as she moved to the next group of men, but her mind was calculating rapidly. Hamilton wasn't just wealthy, he was a zealot. True believers were always the most dangerous because they couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be bought off, couldn't see past their own convictions to the human cost of their ideologies. Men like Hamilton would burn the world down before admitting they were wrong. Later that night, after the gathering had dispersed and the staff had finished cleaning, Celeste sat in Rousseau's office delivering her report. She described Hamilton's speech, the reactions of the other men, the undercurrent of fear and excitement that had charged the evening. Rousseau listened intently, his fingers drumming on his desk. "Hamilton is positioning himself as a leader for difficult times. Smart. When crisis comes, and it will come, people follow the ones who seem certain, even if they're certainly wrong. Do you believe there will be war?" Rousseau looked at her sharply. "Does it matter what I believe? I'm a businessman, Celeste. I profit in peace and I'll profit in war. The key is being positioned correctly for either outcome." "And the slaves? What happens to us when war comes?" "That's not your concern." "With respect, sir, it's the only thing that should concern me." Celeste's voice remained respectful, but there was steel underneath. "If there's war, I need to know if you'll protect your property or abandon it when it becomes inconvenient." Rousseau's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my—" "I'm asking about my survival, sir, and I'm reminding you that I've been loyal for 2 years, that I've given you information that has made you money and protected you from rivals, that I've never asked for anything except to be allowed to continue serving effectively." She paused. "All I want to know is whether that loyalty will be reciprocated." The silence stretched between them, thick with calculation. Finally, Rousseau smiled, not warmly, but with a kind of respect. "You've learned to negotiate. That's dangerous for a slave." "You taught me, sir. Every transaction I've witnessed here has been a lesson in negotiation. I'm simply applying what I've observed." Rousseau laughed, a genuine sound. "Fair enough. Very well, I'll make you a promise. If war comes and things fall apart, I'll give you papers. Freedom papers. Not because I'm generous, but because by then you'll know enough about me and my business that it will be cheaper to make you free than to risk you talking." Celeste's heart beat faster, but her expression remained calm. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. You'll earn those papers by continuing to serve exactly as you have been, by being my eyes and ears, by making yourself so valuable that I can't afford to lose you." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. "Which brings me to your next assignment." "Assignment?" "Pierce Hamilton is staying in New Orleans for another week. He's rented a house in the Garden District and is holding smaller, more private meetings. I want you there." "How?" "I work here. I'm lending you to him as a gesture of hospitality, a skilled house servant to ensure his stay is comfortable. Rousseau's smile was cold, and to ensure I know everything he discusses in those private meetings. Hamilton is planning something, Celeste. Something bigger than tonight's speech. I need to know what it is before my competition does. Celeste took the envelope. It contained her temporary transfer papers and Hamilton's address. When do I leave? Tomorrow morning, Henri will take you. You'll pose as my gift to an honored guest. Hamilton won't suspect anything because men like him never suspect the servants are listening. But you... Rousseau leaned forward. You listen to everything. Every name, every plan, every document you can glimpse, because Hamilton is either going to be the most powerful man in a new southern nation, or he's going to be a traitor hanged by the United States government. Either way, knowing his secrets will be valuable. As Celeste left the office, envelope in hand, she felt the familiar thrill of a new game. But this time, the stakes were higher than a single plantation owner's ruin. This time, she was about to gain access to the planning stages of a rebellion that might destroy everything, including her own carefully constructed position. The next morning, Henri drove her to Hamilton's rented mansion in the Garden District. The house was stunning, white columns, manicured gardens, the kind of place that announced wealth so loudly it didn't need to say a word. Hamilton's personal valet, an elderly black man named Moses, greeted them at the servants' entrance. "You're the girl from Rousseau's place?" Moses's voice was gruff but not unkind. "Yes, sir. I'm Celeste." Moses studied her with sharp eyes that had seen too much and survived by learning when to look away. "Master Hamilton is particular. He doesn't like mistakes, doesn't like noise, doesn't like anyone pretending they're more than what they are. You keep your head down, do your work, and you'll be fine." "I understand." "Do you?" Moses's voice dropped lower. "Because I heard things about you, girl. Heard you're smarter than most. Smart can serve you well or get you killed, depending on who notices. Master Hamilton notices everything." It was a warning, delivered with the weary concern of one survivor to another. Celeste nodded her thanks and followed Moses inside. The next 6 days were an education in revolutionary planning. Hamilton's private meetings included plantation owners, politicians, newspaper editors, and even a few northern sympathizers who believed in states' rights over federal authority. They gathered in Hamilton's study, around his dining table, in the garden at night when the mosquitoes made being outside nearly unbearable, and Celeste served them, poured their wine, lit their cigars, stood in the corner ready to refresh a glass or retrieve a document, and listened. She learned about secret funding for pro-slavery militias in Kansas, about plans to acquire weapons before any formal conflict began, about politicians who would support secession when the moment came and others who were still wavering, about the economic calculations that suggested an independent South could survive, even thrive, by trading directly with Britain and France, bypassing northern ports entirely. She learned that Hamilton's vision wasn't just political, it was apocalyptic. He genuinely believed God had ordained slavery as a civilizing force, that the South's way of life represented human society at its pinnacle, and that any attempt to dismantle it was satanic in origin. Men who believed they were doing God's work were capable of anything. On the 6th night, Hamilton hosted his final meeting. Just 3 men in his private study, the door closed. The conversation so quiet Celeste had to strain to hear through the door where she waited for any call to refresh drinks. "Needs to happen before the election. Too risky. If we move before we have the votes. Gentlemen, risk is inherent in revolution." The word revolution hung in the air like smoke. Celeste pressed her ear closer to the door crack. Hamilton's voice, calm and certain. "The North will never let us go peacefully. We know that, so we stop asking permission and start preparing for the inevitable. Within 5 years, there will be war. The only question is whether we enter it strong or scrambling." "And you believe we can win?" one of the others asked. "I believe God favors the righteous, and we are righteous in defending our property and our way of life. But faith alone won't win wars. We need weapons, we need alliances, and we need to ensure that when the moment comes, our slave population doesn't rise against us. They won't, the third man said dismissively. They're docile, controlled. Are they? Hamilton's voice held a note of something that might have been worry. I've heard disturbing reports. Slaves who can read. Slaves who communicate across plantations. Slaves who are far more aware of politics than we'd like to believe. The Nat Turner Rebellion was 20 years ago, gentlemen. Do you think the slaves have forgotten? Do you think they're not waiting for opportunity? Celeste's blood ran cold. She'd never heard Hamilton acknowledge slave humanity before, even in the form of recognizing them as a potential threat. So, what do you propose? One man asked. Stricter controls. Immediately. No more tolerance for literate slaves. No more casual trust. Every plantation needs to review its property and eliminate anyone who might be dangerous when conflict comes. Better to lose a valuable worker now than face an uprising later. You're talking about selling off thousands of slaves based on suspicion. I'm talking about survival, about protecting our families and our futures. And yes, if that means being ruthless with our property, then we must be ruthless. Hamilton's voice hardened. Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. The meeting continued for another hour, but Celeste had heard enough. She retreated quietly to the kitchen, where Moses was dozing in a chair, waiting to lock up after the guests left. Bad meeting? He asked without opening his eyes. How did you know? Because you look like you've seen a ghost. Which means you heard something that scared you. Which means you should forget it immediately, child, because knowing dangerous things is how slaves get disappeared. Celeste sat down across from him. Moses, how long have you worked for Hamilton? 20 years, since I was younger than you. And in that time, have you ever seen him hesitate to do something cruel? Moses finally opened his eyes, regarding her with profound sadness. No. Master Hamilton believes absolutely in what he's doing. That makes him more dangerous than the ones who know they're wrong. Can't bargain with belief, child. Can't reason with it. Can only survive it. What if surviving means doing something about it? Moses's expression hardened. Don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't. I've seen smart slaves try to fight back, try to escape, try to expose their masters. You know what happened to them? Nothing good. And the ones who loved them suffered too. So we just accept it. Accept that men like Hamilton are planning a war that will destroy us either way. Either we stay slaves if the South wins, or we get caught in the crossfire if the North wins. We survive, Moses said quietly. Same as we always have. By being smarter than they think we are and quieter than they fear we are. By waiting for opportunities and taking them when they come. But not by being heroes. Heroes die, Celeste. Survivors live. He was right. Celeste knew he was right. But she also knew that the information she'd gathered over the past week about the weapons, the funding, the political alliances, the timelines was valuable. Not just to Rousseau, but potentially to others. To people who might be able to stop what Hamilton and his compatriots were planning. The question was whether she was brave enough or foolish enough to try. That night, back in her small room in Hamilton's house, Celeste made the most dangerous decision of her life. She took a piece of paper from Hamilton's study. He'd never miss one sheet from his abundance, and in tiny, careful handwriting, she copied every detail she could remember from the week's meetings. Names, dates, plans, funding sources, weapon caches. Then she folded the paper into a tiny square and hid it in the hem of her dress, sewn into a seam where only the most thorough search would find it. The next morning, Henri came to return her to the Maison Rousseau. As they drove through the New Orleans streets, Celeste said quietly, "Henri, I need you to do something for me, something dangerous." He didn't take his eyes off the road. "I'm listening. There's a letter I need delivered, not to Rousseau, to someone else." "Who?" "I don't know yet, but someone who can use the information it contains, someone who might be able to stop what's coming. Henri was quiet for so long that Celeste thought he might refuse. Finally, he spoke. "You're talking about fighting back, about betraying your master. I'm talking about surviving what comes next, and maybe, just maybe, helping others survive too. It's suicide. Maybe. But doing nothing is suicide too, just slower." They arrived at the Maison Rousseau before Henri could respond. But as Celeste climbed down from the carriage, he caught her arm gently. "I'll think about it. That's all I can promise. I'll think about it." It was more than she'd dared hope for. That evening, delivering her report to Rousseau, Celeste provided every detail he'd asked for about Hamilton's meetings. She was thorough, professional, valuable. Rousseau nodded with satisfaction, already calculating how to profit from the information. But she didn't tell him about the letter hidden in her dress, about the decision she'd made to do more than just survive, about the possibility that a slave woman with a good memory and a willingness to take terrible risks might be able to change history, even if her name never appeared in any history book. Because that was the final lesson Virginia and New Orleans had taught her. Power didn't come from being visible or celebrated. It came from being underestimated by people who never suspected that the woman pouring their wine was really memorizing their plans, that the woman they ordered around was really orchestrating their downfall, that the woman they owned on paper was really free in the only way that mattered, free to choose what to do with the knowledge she possessed. 3 weeks later, a package arrived at the office of a small abolitionist newspaper in Philadelphia. It contained no return address and no explanation, just pages of detailed information about Southern revolutionary planning, written in an educated hand that the editor assumed belonged to a sympathetic white Southerner willing to risk exposure. The editor published the information anonymously. Other papers picked up the story. Politicians in Washington began asking questions, and slowly, very slowly, the wheels of response began to turn. Hamilton never knew where the leak came from. He suspected rivals, business enemies, northern spies. He never suspected the quiet slave woman who'd served wine in his study for 1 week before disappearing back into the vast population of New Orleans's enslaved. Rousseau never knew either. Celeste remained his valued intelligence agent for 3 more years until the war finally came in 1861 and chaos descended on the South like Judgment Day. And when the Union Army entered New Orleans in 1862, Celeste was there to greet them with Rousseau's business records in hand, everything she'd copied over 4 years, every secret, every dealing, every compromise he'd made with the Confederate cause. She traded that information for protection, for freedom papers, for a new life. Rousseau was arrested as a Confederate sympathizer and died in prison before the war ended. Hamilton fled to Texas and was never heard from again. The Maison Rousseau was seized by the Union and converted to a hospital for wounded soldiers, and Celeste disappeared into the flood of newly freed people rushing north, carrying nothing but one small bag and a lifetime of secrets she would never tell. She'd learned the most important lesson of all. The greatest power wasn't in destroying your enemies personally, it was in arranging circumstances so they destroyed themselves while you walked away free. Years later, old families in both Virginia and Louisiana would still whisper about the curse that had struck so many of their patriarchs, about the mysterious documents that appeared, the secrets that were exposed, the fortunes that crumbled. They called it bad luck. Divine punishment, the hand of fate. They never called it what it really was, a woman named Celeste, who'd learned to be a weapon so subtle that no one ever saw the blade until after it cut. She'd smiled at them, she'd served them, she'd remembered everything, and in the end she'd survived them all, not by breaking her chains with violence, but by using them as a disguise while she picked every lock that kept her captive.